Okay. So good evening. Simon Jacobson is my name. And I welcome you all, as well as the web audience. Warm regards from the Holy Land. I just landed literally 2 hours ago. So I bring the holiness and the wisdom and all the power of Israel with me here. Can you tell on my face? Oh, really? Good. That's good. Okay. Okay. I hope it lasts. I was just there for a 2-day visit. It was a short visit, meaningful visit. And we'll talk tonight about the curse of divisiveness. It's not a pleasant topic to discuss. Yet it's a very hard reality in our lives, personal, communal, and global. And it happens to be also a central theme of this week's Torah portion, as well as in general the time period in which we're in, which is called the 3 weeks that began yesterday, Tuesday, with a fast day. The 3 weeks, exactly Tuesday. 3 Tuesdays later will be Tisha B'Av, 3 weeks, 21 days. Called Ben Hamtzarim, sometimes based on a verse in the book of Lamentations, Echa, which we read Tisha B'Av at night, which literally means Ben Hamtzarim means between the two straits, between the dire straits, referring to this period. This is the saddest time in the Jewish calendar. Historically, the most tragic events in Jewish history happened in this period. Shivasar B'Tammuz yesterday, in both temples, well, according to some opinions, the Babylonians first, and 490 years later the Romans scaled the walls of Jerusalem. And 3 weeks later to the day, on Tisha B'Av, both temples were burned down. Again, respectively by the Babylonians, the first temple, and then the Romans, the second. So it's just interesting that it happened on the same day, the same period. So, punctuated by these two sad events are the 3 weeks, which means that basically it escalated from scaling the wall all the way till actual burning down the temple. So ever since then, we commemorate this period in time. It's a form of mourning and grieving, even though it's thousands of years later, to recollect and the sadness of the destruction of the temple, which in itself begs the question, why do we cry over a building, a structure? Even when, God forbid, someone sits Shiva, which are 7 days, not more, not less, for the loss of a parent or a close relative. So it's specifically not more than 7 days. And here, we're talking about close to 2,000 years that we're sitting Shiva. Tisha B'Av, actually, the lights are dimmed in the synagogues, the chairs are lowered, and it's an actual Shiva in many ways, which is not consistent with the laws of Avelis, of mourning and grieving, which says that you mourn and grieve and then you move on and you grow through it and you go to the next level. So I'll answer that question in the process. But going back to the divisiveness issue, that this was not just, so technically the temple was destroyed, and before that, on the 17th of Tammuz, the Mishnah says 5 different sad things that happened, sad traumatic events, the breaking of the tablets, and other events like that, and the same thing on Tisha B'Av. But on a deeper spiritual and psychological level, the root of it all comes down to human behavior. See, the reason we grieve over a temple, over a building, is because it wasn't just a building. It was a gate between heaven and earth. As Jacob tells us in the Bible tells us that when Jacob was traveling, and he was escaping Esau and traveling toward Haran, where he would ultimately build his family, so it says on the way he fell asleep. Vayetze Yaakov Be'er Sheva. Right in the beginning of the chapter, he fell asleep and he had the famous dream, Jacob's ladder. But in the middle, when he realized where he was, he woke up and he was very disturbed because he said, I did not realize the holy ground I was sleeping on, which is the holy Temple Mount. Even though the temple wasn't built yet, but that was a holy ground even before that, because certain offerings were brought there. It was a sacred ground. And that's when he says the expression, Zeh Shar Hashamayim. This is the gate to heaven. That's Jacob's expression. So the temple is not just a building, it's a bridge, an interface between heaven and earth, between spirit and matter, between soul and body, between these two seemingly disparate worlds. So the temple becomes a bridge that connects them. So when the temple was destroyed, it wasn't just a building, another building, and you could always rebuild another one in its place. It actually was a gate was closed in some ways. And ever since, when we say we're in exile, in Golus, we say, because of our sins, we've been exiled. Exile isn't just a physical displacement that the Jews were chased out of Israel by the Romans then, and now are making their way back. But it was also, more importantly, it was a spiritual displacement. It was a loss of purpose. It was like a loss of mission, a sense of spiritual disparity and dissonance that has since then plagued us till this day. So that's why even in Israel, during the holidays, they also say the prayer, Mipnei Chateinu Galina Martzenu, which means because of my sins, because of our sins, we were exiled from the land. You'd wonder, why would anyone say that in Israel? They are in Artzenu. Why do they say Galinu Martzenu? Because clearly Golus, exile, is not just a physical thing, it's a spiritual thing. You can be in the Holy Land and also not be connected, unfortunately. So the root of the whole issue here, therefore, is basically our connection to our roots, our connection to our purpose. What's the difference? What's the opposite of a connection? Is a disconnection, and hence divisiveness. So the Talmud actually states it very loud and clear. It says that the second temple was destroyed because of sinas chinam, because of baseless hatred. The Jews had hatred to each other. There was infighting. There was divisiveness. As such, God basically said, in a divided home I cannot rest. What's the point of having a holy temple when the whole point is that God rests among us? You know the expression in the Bible, it's not God resting in the building. It says, build for me a temple and rest, I will rest among you. Why did it say among you? The beginning of the verse says, build me a temple. It should have said, I will rest in it. That's where the Shalah asked the question. And the answer he gives is because the purpose of the temple is not that God rests in the stones and the wood and the objects and the materials that the Mishkan or the Mikdash were made out of, but that God rests among us. Now when the us is divided, God cannot rest. Think of it like a parent cannot come home when the children are at war with each other. So in a sense, it was our own undoing. It was our own doing that caused God's Shekhinah, God's presence, to be unable to rest in that place any longer. That's what it says in the Talmud, divisiveness. Now, we live in a world where it's a given that people are divided against each other. Firstly, just simply pure observation, empirical observation. You see, everyone is focused on their own self-interest, and the only reason we coexist and there's cooperation is because there's mutual benefit. That's the world in which we live. So maybe when you're young and naive, you feel that people can just love each other unconditionally, it's one thing. But then when you're thrown into the hard, cruel world, you suddenly realize that everyone's out for themselves. The dog eats dog world. And survival of the fittest. And then when you know a little science and psychology, that make the case that the human being basically is a self-absorbed narcissist. And Freud puts it in the most extreme terms, the id, where a person is completely focused on just self-pleasure, principle, self-interest, and everything else is superimposed. And then when you see, as I said, you witness it around, it becomes part of reality. That divisiveness seems like the natural state of affairs. It's a miracle when people get together, basically. So which is the anomaly, the divisiveness or coexistence and peace? And then when you witness all the wars through history, and till this day, wars that are fought in different countries, between countries, within countries, civil wars, and then you bring it further into our own communities, it becomes a given, sadly, that we have made peace with war, basically. We made peace with what Judaism would call the anomaly. Because obviously the Jewish approach is that divisiveness is not the natural state of affairs. And to the extent that it's become something that's acceptable. I'll never forget my father telling me, my father was born in Moscow. And he lived in the former Soviet Union under Stalin, which is a completely different world than the world in which we live. A world driven by fear, a world that every day you do not know what's going to be tomorrow. None of the securities that we take for granted and the freedoms and so on. And you can sit in a room like this and study Torah and do whatever you wish, no one will bother you. In that Soviet Union, sitting here was at great risk to your life. There were informers, you could be arrested. I mean, it was just a constant state of fear and panic and so on. My father tells me the story about when he was a little kid and they came to arrest my grandfather. My namesake, my grandfather. So my namesake is Simon. My grandfather was Simon Jacobson. He was a Georgian Jew. But later became a chassid. And he joined a small secret group, the previous Chabad Rebbe, in 1923, made a Blood Pact, called in a secret meeting in Moscow, 9 other people, and made it with a minyan, with a quorum, and said, I'm making a Blood Pact that each of us will do whatever it takes to the last drop of blood in our bodies to make sure that Judaism some way survives in this God-forsaken country. Because remember, 1923, right after the Russian Revolution, World War I, and Stalin's coming to power, basically all of Judaism was shut down. I mean, God forbid, I don't even want to mention it, but make believe that everything in the United States called Jewish is suddenly forbidden. And Russia was then America as far as the Jewish population. You're talking about millions and millions of people. Some say there were 10 million Jews in the 20s and 30s. You know, the first immigration that came to the United States is mostly from Russia because of the pogroms. That was in the early... So, some say in the beginning of the 20th century there were 10 million Jews, Russia and Eastern Europe. Which could make sense because that was the major bulk of the population of the Jews. And you know, remember Hitler killed 6 million just alone in Europe and Eastern Europe. So the numbers are not that. It could have been a lot more than that as well. But the previous Chabad Rebbe basically refused to yield, and he called in these 9 men, and one of them was my grandfather. And of course they were a great risk because they would go around and build these secret underground synagogues and mikvahs and circumcise children and slaughter kosher meat and just keep the flame burning. You could think, what was he going to accomplish? 1 man, 10 men against a mighty Soviet Union. But look who prevailed. No, his grandchildren, this Rebbe and all his descendants, are here alive and kicking. I'm one of them. And Stalin's grandchildren, no one even knows where they are. The Soviet Union had crumbled ever since. Judaism was going through a renaissance in that country. So, my grandfather was a part of that group, and he was arrested, you know, for these what they called counter-revolutionary forces. And my father told me how he remembered vividly. He was a little kid, how they came to arrest him in Moscow. And my grandmother was crying. I mean, you're talking about a young man. My grandfather was 29 years old when they arrested him. My grandmother was 27. I mean, the baby, and my father and his little brother were babies. They were 6, 5 years old. Now, when someone was arrested then, you didn't come out that fast. You didn't come out at all. So it was a given that was assumed that the person was dead. So, of course, my grandmother would go every day, my father told me, to the government offices, trying to find out, trace. I mean, they knew he was sent off to Siberia, but as I said, no one really came back from there. But this is the thing that struck me, and something I'll never forget, my father telling this to me. He says the night after he was arrested, there was a knock on the door, like late at night. And my grandmother got scared. You know, my father was her son, my father was awake with her. You know, who's coming? They open the door, and it's an older chassid. It's an older chassid who snuck his way in there. And he had 2 bags, and he put them down. And they had a significant amount of money, ruble. And he said to her, you probably need this, so keep this. Now he was not a relative, he wasn't her brother, he wasn't a family member. He was a chassid in Moscow. And he just put down, and I remember when my father told it to me, I said to him, so this was common? Like this is what people did? He says, yeah. He said, no one had bank accounts. There was such thing as retirement plans. No one was going anywhere. We're all in the same boat, and everybody was constantly under the threat of the gun. Anybody could be killed any minute. I said, so there was this real, complete sharing, money? And those that had shared, because it was a given. And I said, so what happened when they came to America? He said, everything changed. Here there's bank accounts. Everybody has a plan. And it struck me how different the two worlds are. And this was my father who was in both worlds. And he saw how it changed. And it struck me about, whether divisiveness is really natural or not. It's become a given to us because we live in that type of world. Even if it's not malicious, each of us has our bank account. Each of us has our so-called space. There's an expression that's sometimes used in a positive way, but sometimes in a negative way. It says, in times of peace in Israel, it was ish tachas gafne v'ish tachas teinase. Each person lived under his vineyard, near his vineyard, and near his teinase, his fig trees. So on one hand, it's a positive blessing. It's like saying it's a time of peace. Everybody's home in their own place, calm. This one has their vineyard, this one has their fig tree. But it's also often used the opposite way, that people are just involved in themselves. And everyone's under their fig tree or under their vineyard, and there's no caring about another. Now, we all have, obviously, certain noble side to us. People can be charitable and kind and giving, but it often takes a lot of effort for some, and it's not something that's always common. So my father describing that scenario, struck a chord in me that started thinking about how kind of world we live in. Because it seems so normal. I mean, why shouldn't everyone have their own bank account? Why let's just share our bank accounts? I mean, each of us, everybody makes their money, ingenuity and efforts and geniuses. Why would they share from their income with another person? There's no real answer with that, and I don't think they have to necessarily. But there was once a world where that was not an issue, because the priorities of life were outshined the people just taking care of their own particular needs. So when you talk about divisiveness in the broad sense of the word, in the world that nations are at war with each other, many people see it as a natural thing. Nations are diverse, they have different interests, and as such, they're going to ultimately at times be at war with each other, unless they find some way to find some mutual benefit. But let's take the point all the way back to ourselves personally, and there we don't tolerate it so much. The word divisiveness, as I said, on a global level becomes so distant and vague and abstract that it doesn't really bother us in a way, even though nobody likes war. But the idea is, okay, that's the nature of the universe. But let's take it all the way back to our personal lives, each of us. What is it like to grow up in a home that is divided? What does it do to a child? To each of us growing up in a fractured environment. And then suddenly, it doesn't become such an abstract, vague concept, because then it hits home, no pun intended. When you speak about large numbers, okay, yeah, nations, they have different interests. Some nations, some leaders are seeking power. We don't see the so-called negative consequences of that type of divisiveness quite as much as we see it in our own personal lives. So when you look at divisiveness, growing up in a home, say a child is born into a home where the parents do not get along with each other. Broken home. Even if they're living with each other. 50% of children will grow up in a divorced home. Now, a divorced home means technically divorced, legally divorced. How many are emotionally divorced and just technically together? No one really knows that number. So what is the impact on the psyche of a child that grows up in an environment like that? It's almost impossible to really do studies, because number one is most people don't acknowledge it and don't talk about it. And many of these things, you can't really go interview little children who are before the age of being able to communicate. The damage is done at a time when the children can't really express it. All we can see it is in the consequences of what these children turn into as an adults. Now, I didn't do any scientific studies, but from the little I see, and from the little I've been exposed to, most people are struggling and haunted by their childhoods. Some more conscious, some less conscious, some going through a lot of therapy, some less. And it affects, above all, it affects your ability to trust, your ability to love, the ability to commit. Everything that requires some form of vulnerability is going to be affected by a child growing up in a divisive environment. Why? Because divisiveness upsets the balance, upsets your sense of security. That's what divisiveness does on a very basic level. You come into a room and people are fighting there. If you go to a party and the hosts, you can tell, are bitter. It spills over to the rest of the room, whether they say it or not. You just feel there's a certain tension in the room. You go to, obviously, to a party or to an event where the hosts are pleasant. It also spills down. There's something very revolting and even repulsive when you're in a tense environment. You don't want to be there, because divisiveness does something to our soul and psyche that is very disturbing. What does it really do? Let's analyze it. What it does is it makes you feel insecure, basically. Because you can't trust the situation. Because divisiveness means there's two agendas, and these two individuals can't get along. So what does it leave the person who's so-called vulnerable to the situation completely confused? This is even true for adults, mind you. You go into a room where two people are fighting, you just want to get out of there. And if they try to get you involved, you really don't want to be involved. What impact does it have on children who don't even have the ability to process what I'm saying? And they're just completely vulnerable. The damage must be a devastating effect. The joke they tell about this guy doesn't have a home, didn't have a place to stay, so he calls his sister and says, "Can I stay by you for a while?" So she asks her husband, he says, "Okay, fine, let him stay." How long? He's going to stay for a week. Well, the week becomes a month, and the month becomes 6 months, And finally one day the husband, the brother-in-law, basically tells his wife, "Listen, it's your brother, and enough is enough. I mean, he's just constantly, with their breakfast, lunch, supper, he's nice, but who needs him here? I mean, he's just an extra presence, It's one thing for a little while, like he's moved in." And so she says, "Listen, he's my brother, that's why I'm so close. You're not, you're essentially, you're not blood connection. It's easier for you to say something than for me." And of course they get into a fight, who should be the one. So they come up with a brilliant plan. And it's one of the Chelam ideas, Chelam stories. They said, tomorrow morning by breakfast, he'll always be there cordially by breakfast, and he helps prepare and clean up and all that. So by breakfast, you and I, the husband and wife, made up, we'll get into a fight about some stupid issue, some political topic. You, for example, will be pro-Democrat, I'll be pro-Republican, and we'll have some fight. And we'll really get the fight going, really escalate into a real battle. And then we'll turn to him and say, "What do you think?" And whoever side he takes, the other one says, "Out of this house." That would be our so-called excuse to get him out of here. Of course, these type of plans usually backfire, and this one did too. So that's what happens the next morning. They get into this fight, and then what happens, of course, they get into a real fight. Because they started as a fake fight, but then they took it too seriously, and then they suddenly both looked at each other and they realized why they're fighting. So they both looked at him and said, "What do you think?" To the brother-in-law, to the brother-in-law. So he says, I can't get involved here. I have to be on both your good terms, Okay. So he ended up staying there, and they ended up fighting. The point is that divisiveness, as I said, when you analyze it, it doesn't take much to understand why it's so disturbing, because we humans gravitate to unity on every possible level. Unity just creates calm in our spirits, in our psyches. And you see this even from young children on. Look at children, you give them objects of different shapes and sizes. Without any training or education, they will naturally fit a sphere into a sphere, a star into a star, a circle into a circle, a square, a rectangle into a rectangle. You'll see. They will look to make sense of it. I'm not talking about a newborn. I'm talking about once a child is able to. And we too, we naturally try to make order in our lives. You get a lot of bits of information, you figure out some way to organize it. Even the most disorganized of people, if you ask them, they have their own so-called organization. As I think I mentioned here, once came into an office, and the guy had a desk, I'm telling you, it was almost to the ceiling, full of papers, literally, the whole thing. And I said, "How do you ever find anything?" So he says, "Tell me what you're looking for." And I mentioned something, and he knew, he pulled it right out. In his mind, this disorganization was organized. Well, what do they say? They say, if a cluttered desk is a sign of a cluttered mind, what is an empty desk a sign of? That's the justification. So point being that even so-called disorganized people, they have their own way, certain type of organization, because the thing is, chaos Chaos, we abhor chaos. We're disturbed when things don't make sense, when we see things don't fit. We call beauty, for example. And beauty is one of those elusive terms. What makes something beautiful? No one really has a full answer. Is it beauty is in the eyes of the beholder? Yet there are things that are objectively beautiful that many, many people will all consider to be beautiful. The best that scientists can come up with is that some form of invisible symmetry. A beautiful face. What makes a beautiful face? Is it the eyes? Is it the nose? Is it the mouth? The complexion? It's a combination of all of them, particular symmetry, and how they're juxtaposed with each other. When something is a little off, it disturbs us. So the concept of the effect of divisiveness on the psyche, no matter whether you're adult or a child, is very profound, because, and now this is the deeper reason for it, the Kabbalistic, mystical, psychological reason, is because the universe is naturally a united place. When we say Hashem Echad, the most famous of all liturgies, the prayer Shema, we're saying not just that God is one, but that there's one reality. There's a fundamental unity that's inherent to all of existence. Now, this isn't just a religious concept today. Once upon a time, you could say this is a mystical concept. This is what science talks about all the time, the search for unity. The unified field theory is that elusive theory that will connect all theories. So they've got it down to 3 laws. So once upon a time, before there was the development of modern science, when you saw phenomenon in the world, everything seemed to be fragmented. Basically, science is the discovery of unifying laws that make us understand different, seemingly diverse phenomena under one rule, or under one law, or under several laws. And truth is, every system, whether it's geometry, or it's physics, or it's business, or any type of anything in the political or social or physical sciences, is all about finding those laws. A master, an expert, is someone that knows the shortcuts and knows the fundamental principles. Marketing experts can give you down to the 4 Ps and the 5 thises and 5, 6 that, because there's systems that have been developed over time. Obviously, nothing is foolproof. They could always be modified and improved. But principles are what creates efficiency, and we gravitate toward efficiency. That's on a very basic, even business level. On an emotional level, divisiveness upsets the whole balance within us. In Kabbalistic terminology, there are 2 worlds. There's a world called Tohu and a world called Tikkun. Tohu comes from the second verse in the Torah, where we say, in the beginning God created heaven and earth, and then it says, and the earth was Tohu v'vohu, which is usually translated as Pust und Vist in Yiddish, which means empty and void. You could also say what it really means, Tohu v'vohu, chaotic, empty and chaotic. But this word Tohu in the Kabbalah takes on turns into a major world. It's a world of chaos. But how is this chaos explained? Interestingly, it's explained in 2 ways. Number 1, and just as a contrast, there's Tohu and there's Tikkun. So Tohu is the world of chaos, and Tikkun is the world of repair. We call Tikkun Olam. It comes from that expression. So Tohu and Atzilus, the world of unity, the world of Tikkun, repair. What's the distinction between the world of unity and the world of repair and the world of chaos? So 2 key things, 2 key features distinguish between both of them. In the world of chaos, there's a disparity and there's a very disproportion between the energy, as they call it in the containers, between form and function, between spirit and matter. As the way it's stated is that the energies, the lights, are so intense that they cause the kalim, the containers, to shatter. What that means in simple English, it means that chaos is caused by disparity, when things are not even. You bring, let's say, someone who's a brilliant teacher to engage with a bunch of idiots, there's going to be disparity, because his light is too great for their containers. Some person, for example, doesn't have disciplined love. You can love someone and kill them with your love too. Because love is not just about giving, it's also about measuring the giving toward the containers of the person that can receive it. So the first thing in the world of orders requires balance. A balance between the energy and the container. Too much energy without proper containment can be destructive. The second feature that distinguishes between the chaotic world, chaos, toyu, and tikkun, is that in toyu everything consists of two paths, and in tikkun there's a third path. There's a middle path. What that means is that in toyu, in tikkun, in chaos there's extremes, extreme right, extreme left. In tikkun there's a middle path that moderates, that again creates balance. To use an example in our own bodies, we're all structures. For a structure to stand, it has to have at least 3 legs. Same thing in architecture. For a structure to have balance, it must have 3 dimensions at least. 4 dimensions make it even more solid. A human body, what would it be like if we had, God forbid, everything working except the spine? The spine, which runs through the middle of the body, is the balancing force. So in the world of chaos, you have 2 extremes. They're very powerful. But there's no moderator. There's no middle path that creates a balance between the 2. And in tikkun there is that third path. So bottom line is, to go back to what we're discussing here, divisiveness is the result of this imbalance. And when there's divisiveness, things cannot stand. You see, for example, great armies, great projects, with excellent teams, excellent soldiers. As soon as they became divided, all their strengths became worthless, even worse than worthless. They began to fight with each other. Very often, in good battles, the best way to defeat your enemy is to get them to fight with each other, because then you destroy them from within. And weaker armies have prevailed because they were united. As a matter of fact, it says this even about in holiness. It says that the soldiers of King David, even though he was representing God's will, because they were fighting with each other, they fell to Avshalom, who had a weaker army, and people who were fighting for not a good purpose, but they were united. The power of unity is enormous, because it creates synergy, and more importantly, it prevents all the wasted time and energy that goes into fighting. So divisiveness, going back to a child's life, a child's world, when there's divisiveness, it is like worse than poison. We may not see it because it's invisible, its effect, but basically it undermines the child's stability, balance, security. And as the child grows older in such a climate, it's constantly has to be hyper vigilant because it doesn't know when the next surprise is coming. That's what chaos does. There's no consistency. God forbid you hear about children who grow up and then they tell you about parents dysfunctional, addictive, alcoholic, and so on. The thing that is most blatant in their expression is the inconsistency. I don't know whether I was getting love or not. You know, when you know that for sure someone's your enemy, in a way it's healthier than not knowing whether you're your enemy or not, because then every day is another story. And that unpredictability creates a profound instability and profound lack of trust in your own instincts. And then you become this hyper-vigilant human being who's constantly on guard. You never know when you're going to be smacked next, when you're going to be hit next. This is all the result of divisive forces in our lives. So when we talk about it on that level, it's very clear. It doesn't need to make us enough to make a great case, even though it should be elaborated upon, of its destructive elements. It destroys a person's life, basically. And the rest of your life is busy trying to rebuild and find security and trust and trying to rebuild tools of confidence and self-esteem that were essentially stolen from you because you didn't have that type of environment. Now, I hope none of this resonates with anyone in this room, but I'm sure you know friends that it probably resonates with, so you can use it in that sense. The truth is, I don't think that there's anyone on earth that this does not resonate with, because we all have elements of it. The question is, what measure, to what extent? So in this period of time, when we honor the destruction of the temple, and we honor the 17th of Tammuz leading to Tisha B'Av, really what we're talking about is that we're honoring and we're revisiting the divisiveness within ourselves. Because remember, if there was no divisiveness within you and your psyche, and within you and your family, and within you and your community, there'd be no divisiveness in the larger world as well. Because remember, The larger world is just a bunch of individuals like us. So the first and foremost thing to state, and that's in a fascinating way why we honor the 3 weeks, it's not about grieving over the past. There's no benefit in just dwelling on a broken past. As I said earlier, crying over a destroyed temple. You know what we're dwelling on? We're dwelling on and appreciating the destructive force of divisiveness in our lives. Because half the cure of an illness is awareness. And minimizing it, or ignoring it, or denying it, makes it worse. So basically, these 3 weeks are dedicated toward a war against divisiveness. That's what it said. So just like sinas chinam, baseless hatred, destroyed the temple, what's the counter for the antidote? Baseless love will rebuild it. That's how it works. So the purpose of these 3 weeks is not just to remind us of negative things. It's to remind us the destruction that comes from divisiveness. To the point that, yes, it creates dissonance between us and God, between us and each other, between you and yourself, between you and your family, between nations. So the whole world essentially has been toxified by the divisiveness that began when the temple was destroyed. And then it just spilled over and became to the point that for many of us it became the new reality. And the anomaly for us is when you see unity. That's like a big chiddush. That's a big innovation. So the 3 weeks is about awareness and understanding the consequences of this. And the best place to begin, as I said, is in our own self. Now you'd be amazed how much that type of awareness begins the healing process. So think of it, if you have an infection, God forbid, you're not even aware of it, you can imagine an infection festers, and it can cause a lot of damage in the long term. But as soon as you're aware, you already know there's an intruder inside of you. There's an intruder that you need to do something about. Do something about it. You may not know exactly what to do, but you're already in a place where there's a so-called fresh air. Infection needs fresh air for it to heal. When it thrives in darkness, in ignoring it, in denial, psychologically speaking. So that's the first step. The second is that no matter what happened in our lives, in our childhoods, no matter how fractured, how divisive, there's always a way back to your united soul. Because you see, your soul never really gets damaged. What gets damaged are the arteries, the channels that connect the soul to your life. In other words, the conscious and your conscious awareness of things. But in essence, it always remains intact. That's why you can see this consistently. And I remember several years ago I met someone who was coming to this class, and I would say that this was a epitome of a very fractured life, growing up in a terrible, terrible home. Now this person, she became a musician. She was very musical. She was musically oriented. And I once saw her playing piano. She played some other instruments as well. And there was a calm that came about her when she was playing piano that was very, powerful. More than you just see it regularly. I mean, even every pianist and every instrument player has a certain discipline. When you're good, you have a discipline how you play. It almost seems like effortless, musical. The movements, how a body sways when it plays an instrument, especially piano. But in this case, in this instance, it seemed like much more powerful than that. Like she was in a different place. And she had spoken to me about her life and her situation, completely estranged from her unhealthy parents, going into all the graphic details. But when I saw her playing the music, I realized there was the healing. And she wasn't even aware of it, to the extent why she so gravitated to music, because it was her oasis. It was her ability to find a place of peace, a place of harmony. And yeah, it could be somewhat escapist, but it wasn't unhealthy. It wasn't escapist like going into drugs or self-medicating or numbing to the pain. And at the time it struck me because I was always familiar with the interface and the parallels between music and spirituality. And both are driven by the same thing, soul, which is unity. Music is harmony. Take the same musical notes and play them in the wrong order, and it's unbelievably grating. Try it. Even though the Beatles had this backwards thing that Paul is dead or whatever, But it wasn't music. Maybe you send messages. So it's the same musical notes, but played in the wrong order. Music is harmony, and it responds to the natural harmony of the soul. That's why young children, without any training, and even children in fetuses, there's evidence of babies in the mother's womb that respond to music that's being played and that they can hear. You see movement, the legs, the arms. How do they know that? How do they know to move? Language, you can say a child grows up and hears the parents speak, so they learn to mimic. Even though we know that's not enough either, they must have some language within them, because to learn in 2 years, to speak in 3 years a full language isn't just enough to mimic someone. You see, animals can do that. So clearly a child has something within. But nevertheless, you could say, that's why some children know whatever language it is, the language of their parents. But there's, of course, language is not just the words you use, it's also a certain ability to communicate. But how would they know music? They have no one to look at. A fetus, baby in his mother's womb. So the scientists have not figured that out yet. The Kabbalists say the reason is because music is the language of the soul, and the soul and music are one. As a matter of fact, for a soul to move from one place to the next, it needs a song. So in heaven, in Gan Eden, in paradise, where the souls congregate, they travel through music. A soul within a body, the body travels through our legs, and we have vehicles, etc. But how does the soul move? When you say, I was moved by that, you don't mean physically moved, you mean your heart was moved. Something harmonious from the outside sparked, there was a catalyst that awakened the harmony within you. So this woman, when she was playing music, what was happening was she was able to, through the music, connected to the harmony of her soul that was so locked and trapped. Now her challenge was, and then she learned to figure it out, and I think music therapy does some of this, she learned to figure out how to let it spill over, not just when she was playing piano, but the rest of her life. How can you access that harmony? But the fact that she was able to do that, no matter what her life was like, is clear that this is clear proof that the soul remains intact. It's just, as I said, trapped in a cave with no access. So really what a nurturing environment does for us, as opposed to a divisive one, is it helps you develop the tools to access the harmony that's natural and inherent within the soul. And a lack of a nurturing environment, a divisive environment, basically aborts the ability to build those tools. It doesn't really, in other words, destroy the soul's harmony. It just doesn't give you don't know how to access it. It would be the equivalent of a child growing up and never going to any school. A brilliant child who never learned how to write, never learned how to communicate. So the brilliance is there, but they weren't taught the tools how to access it. You often see these kids in school that are very shy. And sometimes that's misunderstood as being stupid. Or something else, or something wrong with them. Then you find out at some point that some of those shy children are the smartest in the class. They don't express themselves, whatever reason that they're shy. In other words, there's a lot within us that we don't know how to express. And true healing is not about trying to give you something new. It's trying to help you find those things that are inside of you. Some of it you may be aware of, most of it you're not. And find the tools and the so-called the shovels and the picks and the hammers and all the other equipment to draw it out of that person. That's what a good mentor, a good coach can do. They don't give you anything new. They help you recognize it within you and help you develop tools that you may have never learned to use. Which is a tremendous message, because it really means that there's a lot of hope. And all of us are fundamentally intact, as opposed to all the messages we get all day about how broken we are. So yes, intact souls can grow up in broken homes. And the soul remains intact, but there's a disconnect between the soul's harmony and its outer expression. I've seen this countless times. You see people who, their expression is often extremely disturbing. There are people who just have a bitter attitude, for example. Or they have just an attitude, maybe. You don't use the word bitter. And you don't want to, who wants to be around a person like that? And small petty things become big things. Anybody knows anybody like this? The question is whether anybody thinks you're like that. That's the question. Okay, good. Hope so. And it's difficult because sometimes you just don't want to deal with a person like that. But I have seen, as I said countless times, people like that is basically the outer package has become so tough and rough for whatever reason. Either they think that's the way to survive, or that's what they learned from their mother or father, that it conceals a very beautiful person within.